I want to welcome you to our course on Winston Churchill. When Churchill died in January of 1965, Clement Attlee said that he was the greatest Englishman of our time, perhaps the greatest citizen of the world of our time. Now, Clement Attlee was a lifelong socialist. He had worked closely with Churchill during the war, but their political principles were diametrically opposed. And yet, his tribute to Churchill was taken up throughout England, throughout the United States, and over much of Europe. The only correction that was offered by many was that Churchill was the greatest Englishman of all time. As we go into the 21st century, that judgment still stands. He was ranked the greatest Englishman of the 20th century. I think we can call him the greatest statesman of the 20th century. I've used the word great several times, and our course on Churchill complements our earlier courses on the history of freedom, on famous Greeks, and on famous Romans. For it is rooted in the idea that history is made by outstanding individuals, not by anonymous social and economic forces, but by titanic individuals who change the course of history. And it is the argument of this course that Churchill is one such individual. We will begin as Churchill would have begun, with his family tradition of patriotism and service to England in the figure of his ancestor, John, the 1st Duke of Marlborough. We will look at Churchill's youth, his schooling, his relationships with his parents, and see how this troublesome boy, as his mother called him, would achieve by the age of 26 election to Parliament, a war hero, and a self-made millionaire as a best-selling author. And we will follow him in 2 lectures through his early parliamentary career, rising rapidly to become First Lord of the Admiralty, and then falling dramatically in the course of the campaign at the Dardanelles during World War I. We will see him come back into government office, but find him by 1930 in the wilderness, a member of Parliament, but with little influence. We'll see him as a family man. We will see him as a painter, an author. And then we will watch as he, almost alone in England, speaks out in the late 30s against the pressing danger of Hitler and the Nazis. And then, in 2 lectures, we will see him in that moment for which destiny had prepared him, leading the British people to victory in the greatest of all wars. We will see him voted out of office at the very moment of this triumph, come back as Prime Minister, and live on to be a leading elder statesman, speaking out for a united England, a united Europe, and ever closer relationships between the United States and Britain, and for détente with the Soviet Union. And in our final 2 lectures, we will assess his political thought and his place in history. But unlike some recent American presidents, Churchill was not obsessed with his place in history. He was content to say, "I have done my best." And ultimately, our assessment of him will be based on that moment when Britain stood alone against the victorious forces of Nazi Germany, and he rallied his nation. I'd ask you to step back to that moment, to June the 4th, 1940, to the House of Parliament, and Winston Churchill is about to address it. 3 weeks have passed since he became Prime Minister. 3 weeks in which England is passing through what many are calling its darkest days. Churchill does not like to call them dark days. He calls them stern days. But they are stern indeed. In these 3 weeks, the German armies have poured through the Low Countries, into France, and at this very moment, June the 4th, the French army is collapsing. The French army that had fought so bravely all through the First World War is now in retreat. It is surrendering in such masses that the Germans cannot even collect all the prisoners. The Belgian army as well, which fought bravely in the First World War, has surrendered. Now, this is not because the French or Belgian soldier is unwilling to fight. It is not because the French or Belgian civilian is unwilling to go through another war. It is because of a collapse of leadership at the top. The French leaders will not fight. They do not have the will to fight. And Churchill has grasped this on trips to France, in which he has tried to arouse in them again a fighting spirit. And the Belgian army has been surrendered by its king when it still wanted to fight. And that surrender by King Leopold has left some 400,000 British and French troops cut off at a little spit of land called Dunkirk. When Churchill called this meeting of Parliament, he thought he would have to deliver hard and heavy tidings of a surrender of the British Army. But starting on May the 27th, a motley little fleet, garbage scows, Royal Naval vessels, there was even a yacht piloted by an American, have made their way back and forth across the English Channel under heavy enemy fire. And they have rescued some 336,000 British and French troops. It is a cause for jubilation. And yet, as Churchill knows, wars are not won by evacuation. And those who saw these British and French troops march through the streets of Dover read defeat in their eyes. And indeed, at the highest levels of the British government, there is defeatism. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, the King himself, believe that England cannot win this war. That what Britain must do is make a negotiated peace with the Germans. A peace that will leave the British in control of their empire and the Germans in control of the continent. It is indeed because of this defeatism that Churchill has been chosen Prime Minister. You see, a clever politician, and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, is an extremely clever politician. He would be at home today. He believed that Churchill would have to make this negotiated peace, be tarnished by it, and then have to step down. And so, it is to a Parliament expecting to hear feelers of peace. It is to the United States, not yet in the war, of course, but told by its ambassador, Ambassador Kennedy, that England cannot last. And it is to Hitler, who is convinced that the British will make a negotiated peace. England is finished, he has told Hermann Goering. They will make a peace with me. It is to all of these, as well as to the British people, that Churchill speaks on this June the 4th, 1940, and says that although large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and on the oceans. We shall fight with growing strength and growing confidence in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Now, a British lieutenant that had been evacuated from Dunkirk spoke of hearing those words. He said, we had been shattered by the panzers in France. Many of my men didn't even have boots anymore, and all of our equipment was left. We were cold and hungry, and they just dumped us on the road there in Dover. And we woke up that night screaming that the panzers were upon us again. And then I heard Churchill speak. And I said, to hell with the panzers. We're going to win. And with that speech, Winston Churchill rallied the nation. Now, had he taken a public opinion poll on June the 4th, 1940, 80% of the British would have said it is not worth it again. It is not worth 1 million dead. The First World War solved absolutely nothing, and our politicians have just gotten us into the same mess. But newspapers that had been critical of him for years now rallied. They published a picture of a bulldog looking like Churchill with a little Tommy helmet on it saying, "Go to it." And so the British did go to it. Now, the man who so rallied the nation at this critical moment was a statesman. And the central part of our course is to examine what do we mean by a statesman and how is it embodied in Winston Churchill. For Churchill ranks with Pericles of Athens and with Abraham Lincoln of our own country as one of the three outstanding democratic statesmen in history. A statesman has a bedrock of principles. That is how we begin to distinguish a statesman from a politician. A bedrock of principles, unswerving. And Churchill's were rooted in freedom. Someone who knew him well, his private secretary, said, "The spring of all of Mr. Churchill's actions are the idea of freedom. An ideal of individual freedom, not regimented by parties or political ideologies. A tradition of freedom under law going all the way back to Magna Carta. A deep belief in the principles embodied in our Declaration of Independence. For he regarded us and Britain as the two great bastions of liberty." Secondly, a statesman has a moral compass. Now, we have antennae today. We put our antennae out and want to see what other people want us to say. But for Churchill, there was absolute right and absolute wrong. Adolf Hitler represented absolute wrong. Churchill was an ambitious man. Throughout his life, he had been ambitious. But there were things he would not do if they were wrong. A moral compass that guided him and enabled him to set priorities. And then there must be a vision. And Churchill's was the finest of all visions, of ordinary men and women marching into the bright uplands of freedom. Clement Attlee also said, Churchill had an extraordinary concern for the ordinary person. And to him, that was the ultimate touchstone of freedom. Is the ordinary person secure from fear and want? Can the ordinary person play a role in government? Does the ordinary person have the same right to justice as the wealthy? But you also must make a consensus. You must be able to build a consensus to achieve that vision. And for Churchill, it was the written and spoken word. And we will examine him as a master of English prose. He's one of the most powerful speakers in the English language. A statesman who would win the Nobel Prize for literature, and in whose very fiber the lessons of the history that he studied were ingrained. Now, this statesman, who so rallied a nation, was born into wealth and privilege. Born at Blenheim Palace on November the 30th, 1874. And that palace and the memory of its founder, John the Duke of Marlborough, would consume Churchill. He would write a masterful biography of Marlborough from 1933 until 1938. And the career of this English soldier and statesman would be, again, part of that fiber of the lessons of history. So we start with John, the Duke of Marlborough, as Churchill would have wanted us to start. John Churchill was born in 1650, the son of Sir Winston Churchill. Sir Winston Churchill was a man of some standing, prominence, but he had been all but ruined politically as well as financially by the English Civil War. He was a Catholic, and he had sided with the royal party. He had fought against Parliament and for a while had to live in hiding. But with the restoration of the royal house in 1660, Sir Winston got back part of his estate and developed very close ties with the restored king, with King Charles, and was able to find in the service of King Charles places for two of his children, his daughter Arabella and his son John. John became a page with the heir to the throne, Prince James, and Arabella became Prince James's mistress and would bear him children. And John proved himself early on, not just through his sister's connections, but by his own ability, a worthy soldier. And he was commissioned into what would become the Grenadier Guards and was sent out to some of the toughest posts, as in Tangiers. He served as a soldier and then took service, as was quite common, in the armies of the King of France. He served under one of the most famous generals of the age, Turenne, and he also won the attention of King Louis himself, and became very close to James after James became king. But unlike his father, John was a Protestant. He was deeply attached to the Protestant religion. And like other English aristocrats, even those close to King James, he was deeply disturbed and concerned about the king's obvious desire to reestablish Catholicism. And so he entered into negotiations with the ruler of Holland, William, Prince of Orange, and also the husband, as it was, of the king's daughter, Mary. And he was one of the first aristocrats to offer his services, and one placed in an important post because of his role in the army. And so when King James was driven out of the country, and William and Mary became rulers, John was there on the spot. He also was able to play an important role through the close relationship between his wife, Sarah, and the daughter of William, of Princess Anne. And that relationship would grow ever closer and closer, and again play an important role in Marlborough's rise. But he also won the attention and favor of William simply by his ability as a soldier, as a general, but even more by the broad view he took of European politics. For he alone shared in its entirety William's view of the danger of Louis of France. William, in many ways, had simply become King of England because it was one more way of fighting against Louis. He saw in Louis the tyranny that would spread all over Europe unless a small state like Holland resisted. And he had spent much of his life fighting Louis. And now, with the resources of Britain behind him, William continued this war. And John Churchill served closely with him. In fact, in 1689, he had been raised to the rank of Earl of Marlborough. And when William died in 1702, it was the wish of the dying king that Marlborough assume command of all of the British forces. And so he became, under Queen Anne, the commander-in-chief of British forces. And his policy and strategy for defeating Louis became the guiding policy of Britain for the next decade. His desire was to crush the power of France, and to do it by a series of campaigns on the continent. Campaigns with the ultimate goal of establishing Britain as a continental power. Now, it was not a policy that went unchallenged. There was a strong faction in Parliament, the Tories, conservatives, who wanted a far more isolated policy for Britain, a policy that focused upon Spain, a policy that focused upon the colonies of Spain and the commerce of Britain. But for a decade, Churchill was able to fight against Louis. He was never a party man. He was never totally part of the Whigs never totally part of the Tories. He guided above all by his moral authority and his success in the field. He guided a grand coalition, a grand alliance in the War of the Spanish Succession, one more in the series of wars by which Louis attempted to expand his power all over Europe. And the Grand Alliance consisted of Britain, Holland, small states like Prussia and Baden in Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire, the Austrian Empire of the Habsburgs. And not a ruler himself, not with a strong base in Parliament, Marlborough had to hold together this alliance. It was not an easy alliance. The Dutch merchants in Amsterdam had a very bad habit of lending money to King Louis at critical moments, enabling him to reinforce his armies. The German princes had to be encouraged year after year to give their supply of troops. And Austria was always very wary of the aims of Britain. And the Austrian armies were led by one of the finest soldiers of his day, Prince Eugene of Savoy. And so it was with this difficult task that Marlborough sought to intervene against the continental tyrant, as his descendant Winston Churchill would call it. The great victory came in 1704. 2 years, 1702 and 1703, had brought success neither to Louis and the French armies or to the armies of the Alliance. Most of the fighting was done in what we would call Belgium today, a prime goal of the expansion of Louis, until in 1704, Marlborough took a bold plan of marching with his army out of Koblenz, where he had threatened, had faked an attack up the Mosel River into French territory, and instead marched to the Danube. Now, this is the day of the professional army, of soldiers who were brought in and drilled and trained under the most brutal conditions, in which a British officer's wig cost more than an ordinary soldier might make in a lifetime, when aristocrats led the army and the ordinary soldier was considered to be the biggest oaf and the biggest drunkard and the laziest man in his village. When soldiers marched in ordered lines and magnificent uniforms to within 50 yards of each other, and then fired away with their muskets and followed with a bayonet charge. It was a time when generals didn't give that much attention to the care of their ordinary soldier, and the French forces tended to live off the land by foraging. But Marlborough fed his men. He saw to it that they had boots and warm clothes, and they served him with a devotion to a general who always fought right in the front ranks, right alongside them. And they made a march in 1 month from Koblenz to the Danube. And then they captured a major French fortification, storming up a hill 3 times in the face of enemy fire for their commander. Now, French generals, though famous, and though the French army had a reputation for invincibility, did not take this same care. And they didn't have that same attention to detail that Marlborough did. He went out constantly on reconnaissance missions. He always knew exactly where the enemy was. And so it was that on August the 12th, as the evening came on, he was within 2 miles of the French forces. They were so careless, the French were, that they simply lay down and slept that night where they were alongside the road, and could not imagine that Marlborough would bring on battle so quickly. But the next morning, August the 13th, 1704, near a little Bavarian village called Blenheim, he had his troops prepared. Now, Marlborough was a careful student of the tactics of antiquity. He focused upon the tactics of Alexander the Great, and he absorbed one of the central lessons: to hold down both flanks of the enemy, to make them commit their resources to those flanks, thinking that is where your main charge was coming, and then to mass superior force at the critical moment in the enemy's line, in the center. And that is what Marlborough did. He launched the Allied troops first against the little village of Blenheim on his right flank, and then attacked the left flank of the French forces. So savage was the battle around the village of Blenheim that the French committed more and more resources. And they were quite sure that their center, the French center, was protected because a little river, the river Navel, ran in front of it. They thought the river was unfordable. Marlborough knew different. He had indeed crossed it the night before. And he sent his infantry into the center of the French line and then attacked with the full force of his cavalry, attacking in a different formation, a wedge-shaped formation in which it was a thundering cavalry charge. The French were accustomed to ride up with their cavalry, fire their pistols, and turn away. Churchill's men rode directly into the line, their sabers flashing, and broke the French line. Hundreds of Frenchmen fled and dove into the Danube, where they perished, and 11,000 surrendered. It was a victory that destroyed forever the myth of French invincibility and established Marlborough in the minds of his contemporaries as the greatest soldier of the age. Jubilation throughout the Allies, and in Britain, Parliament passed a solemn motion by which he would become not only the Duke of Marlborough, but also a palace would be built for him. The royal manor at Woodstock was given to him, and till this day, Blenheim Palace, named in honor of the great victory, is the only residence in Britain that is called a palace, which is not a royal residence. And there, designed by one of the most famous architects of the age, it was built year after year until it stood within 2,700 acres of magnificent garden and woods and 320 rooms, celebrating in its frescoes the victory of Marlborough, comparing him to Scipio Africanus, the defender of Britain, as Scipio had been the defender of Rome. Great tapestries showing his magnificent victories, not just at Blenheim, but in succeeding years at Ramillies, Oudenarde, Malplaquet. But the grandeur of these victories did not bring resulting decisive success. Louis continued, sponsored in part by the Dutch merchants, who were theoretically his enemy, and no lasting peace was achieved. Marlborough would spend his winters traveling to the courts of Europe, driving through the snows and rain and cold to Prussia to make sure the Prussian king sent his troops into the field, and then coming back to Britain to hold on to his parliamentary majority. But it wasn't easy. His wife quarreled bitterly with Queen Anne. Envy and jealousy of the achievements of Marlborough led to conspiracies against him. His supporters in Parliament were pulled down, and when he asked Queen Anne to make him Captain General of the British armies for life, she refused. And in this loss of royal favor, his enemies moved. He was stripped of his offices, and Jonathan Swift, the author of Gulliver's Travels, was a major journalistic force against Marlborough, attacking him in the most savage fashion as a man who had grown wealthy through the war and wanted only to continue the war to increase his wealth. And so Marlborough would be pulled down from power. He would keep Blenheim Palace, but live the rest of his life embittered. And English historians attacked him. In 1827, Henry Hallam said, "Nothing but ambition and rapacity in his motives, nothing but treachery and intrigue in his means." And the great Macaulay the next year would write, "In no other age could the path to power and glory been open to the manifold infamies of John Churchill." Winston Churchill set out to revise this opinion in his biography, written between 1933 and 1938. He set again upon a pedestal of greatness his ancestor, But more than that, he learned fundamental lessons. A belief that an alliance, even of smaller states, could defeat a continental tyrant. The need for a party base and a position of more than just moral authority if you were going to undertake a grand crusade. But most importantly, that for Britain, the ultimate goal of foreign policy and the preservation of British liberties lay in resisting any power that sought to dominate Europe. And so from early in his parliamentary career, he would recognize the danger of Germany. And then, when the war with Germany was almost won in World War II, he would point out a new continental tyrant arising in the form of Russia. But all that lies in the future. Let us go back to November the 30th, 1874, and the birth of Winston Churchill at Blenheim.